Well, we've roped in a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg, Patrick Bond, to unpack climate change effect that we are seeing ahead of the UN climate conference in Brazil, as well as just to set, that's COP30, of course, set to take place from the 10th to the 21st of November. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Glad to have you again on the show. So Hurricane Melissa has been described, as you've just heard, as the strongest ever storm to hit Jamaica. There's also been a lot of analysis around how this particular hurricane interlocks climate change and global inequality. As we get your analysis and your take, Prof, perhaps speak to us about just how this hurricane's rapid intensification, as we've seen over abnormally warm waters, is a stark example of, climate supercharging.
Well, thanks for having me, and greetings to the viewers and yourself. The main thing about this upsurge of extreme weather is that when you've got coastal areas that suffer from rising temperatures in the water, and in this case it was about 26.5 degrees. And when that happens, the warmth of the water really feeds, it fuels these intense storms. And if the construction, the infrastructure, the housing, all of the systems, electricity and internet, everything are not designed with adaptation or climate resilience, if they're not climate proofed. And that's pretty typical in the poorest areas of Jamaica, of Haiti, also very hard hit with more than 10 dead, and now Cuba. Cuba is a bit different because they've got such strong planning traditions. So you might even have heard of Hurricane Katrina, the worst before this one, which wiped out a big chunk of New Orleans because they were unprepared. Whereas Cuba, with its traditions of planning and evacuations, they'd been able to withstand it. But this is the worst ever, as you say. It's 185 kilometers per hour at the peaks of the wind. So that'll wreck everything in sight. And it does indeed suggest, just as President Lula of Brazil is not only hosting the COP30 in the Amazon in Belém, but he's also just this last week approved oil extraction at the confluence of the Amazon and the Atlantic Ocean, creating another storm of concern about leaders like our own in South Africa that aren't really getting the message to decarbonize.
Yeah, you speak about, of course, just future-proofing some of these areas. We've been hearing, of course, a lot of analysis around just how powerful level 5 is, and hearing that no infrastructure, in fact, in the country can withstand that kind of level. As Jamaica then faces displacement and destruction, possibly Cuba, what fault lines or social fault lines does, this hurricane expose in Caribbean societies?
Well, exactly. This is a period when all of these smaller countries and coastal countries, and it's not just in the Caribbean, we've got the very, very serious problems in Africa. And it's a time when the International Monetary Fund is really cracking down on state spending, when we have debt crises. The interest rates that went up in 2022 haven't really yet come down for the poorest countries, so their debt payment burden is enormous. So that brings a lot of people into this confluence of thinking exactly as you suggest, to deal with the injustices of poor countries who didn't create the climate catastrophe. They have very, very low per person CO2 emissions, the cause of the climate crisis being greenhouse gas emissions. And Jamaica and Cuba and Haiti especially are very, very low. And as a result, the fact that they're taking these huge hits forces the question, well, who should pay? What kind of climate debt is owed by, well, those of us, myself included, who have high CO2 budgets? And so the International Court of Justice on July 23rd finally came up with a statement saying, it's an advisory opinion, it probably will be ignored, but the ICJ in The Hague says, yeah, we need to actually start counting reparations, that is the climate debt. The polluter pays responsibilities. Now, we have the polluter pays here in South Africa, and in most countries, you'll see this sort of liability that goes with those who caused such problems. They should pick up the tab. And that's, I think, the central part of the injustice, isn't it? That they're not doing that. And the Paris Climate Agreement about 10 years ago says, look, if you sign this agreement, you forgive the climate debt. So the ICJ is saying no, and the climate justice movement is also saying no. We actually have to start paying the poorest countries the debt that we owe them because we've caused the problem. And that might mean surrendering some of the financial debt that those countries owe the North.
Yeah. And Prof, just as we wrap our conversation, I was going to ask you about exactly that in terms of just, beyond the scientific and economic agenda, what social and justice issues should then take center stage at COP30. I would also even press take center stage at the G20 happening next month.
Yeah, precisely, because the COP30 and all of the COPs have now been infiltrated by big corporates, especially the fossil fuel companies. We don't expect very much. Last year in Baku and Azerbaijan, the African delegations had to walk out to make their point that the relief, the climate funds that were on offer, about $250 billion a year at the time, weren't anywhere near what even the UN said, 1.3 trillion. It was a Malawian, Evans Majewa, who led that walkout. Unfortunately, South Africa's environment minister, Dion George, who comes from the sort of Santon elites, he's not going to walk out. He's staying with the polluters. And that then brings us to G20, which is the heads of state, November 22nd, 23rd. Everything I've seen from the preliminary work on climate means three things are committed to by the big polluters, that is the G7, the West, and the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a few others. That's the G20. And those three things are terrible. Do not cut the emissions to the extent we need to, number one. Number two, never admit you emitted. Don't acknowledge the climate debt and the polluters pays. And then third, privatize the air. Try to deal with this problem through financial markets. And those are the sorts of, I think, problems that are going to lead to protests by climate activists here.
Prof, I think let's leave it at those 3 points. Thank you so much for your time, Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Patrick Bond.